To imagine is simply to make an image, a picture in our minds. Images mirror the thinking and feeling of those who create them and use them. To this extent, religious imagery serves as a means of visualizing the transcendent, so as to reflect an intimate reality in a world of faith. The most sought-after subject in the world of art has been the image of that of God incarnate, Jesus. Yet historically, no likeness exists of Jesus, and we are therefore mystified as to the exact external appearance of the man called Jesus. The result of this has been that the effigy of Jesus has been left up to the human imagination, which has allowed for Jesus to be conceived of and manifested in a multiple array of imagery. Therefore, when we look at Christianity throughout the world, we see the existence of a diversity of images of Jesus. Since image is a result of conditioning by our culture, and since cultures are so varied, it would seem impossible to reduce the image of Jesus to one set of precepts that will apply everywhere. However, despite the great variety of images that exist of Jesus, it seems that one commonly recognized portrait has become accepted by the popular culture all over the world. This is Jesus as portrayed with certain basic features in a gentle and meek manner, which is often depicted in very fine European features with fair hair and blue eyes. This popular image of Jesus has not only become a standard for America and parts of the Western world, but also for non-European nations where Christianity has become a major religion. Is this really what Jesus could have looked like? To speculate as to what the historical Jesus could have looked like would be an endless and unavailing process.
Once a historical figure becomes an image or passes into being a ritual and a real media image, that is a very different thing than depicting a human being. And that then one has to examine what are the power dynamics, what are the institutions that are ratified by that particular figure. And that's what becomes so complex. That would not be taken away by simply trying to show a first-century Jew. Then there would be other questions to ask about that as image, not as historical figure anymore, because that's irretrievably lost after all these centuries.
In order to understand how the image of Jesus has evolved, we must ask ourselves, what are the factors that have influenced the choices that people have made? To identify an image as visually resembling the historical Jesus, and why one particular image is popular in representing what Jesus looked like most during a certain time. To address these questions, we will examine the transformation in the image of Jesus by tracing the representation from what appears to be the earliest depictions into the development of the popular European image which exists in our contemporary world.
If you trace the visual depictions of Jesus from as early as we have them up until the present moment, it almost recapitulates the history of Christianity, which in its first century really made the transition from a local Palestinian movement into a Hellenistic culture and became, at least a very large part of it, although not all of it, became a European movement. Now there were still churches, there were Coptic churches, there was a church in Ethiopia, there was a continuing part of Christianity in the Middle East. But from the point of view of European Christianity, where the Christianity became, as it were, the kind of religion of the empire, Jesus was Europeanized. And in various ways Europeanized, given the accoutrements of a Byzantine emperor, or a king, or a prince, or whatever. And even when there were reactions against that royalization of the image of Jesus, even the counter images were drawn from European sources.
It is inevitable that Christians would yearn for tangible evidence of how Jesus Christ looked in the flesh. Holy relics, supposedly bearing the imprint of the face of Christ, have captured the imagination of people all around the world. To this extent, the Shroud of Turin especially has been subject to much scientific scrutiny in order to unravel the mystery of its disturbing image. The earliest Christian paintings and images depicting Christ are to be found in the catacombs, where the first Christians for centuries buried their dead. There is an air of temporality in this art, and the focus was not on what Jesus looked like, but on God's acts through Jesus.
Even if you add up all of the material in the 4 Gospels that we have in the Bible, and if you add the so-called extra-canonical sources, they were not really interested in physical descriptions in those days. They were interested in what he did, what he said, and therefore you can only piece together the barest minimum of physical description.
Professor Jane Dillenberger, renowned art historian and author of many books dealing with Christian art, clarifies the relationship between Greco-Roman heritage and Christianity.
The early images in the territory of Rome, where the church was being built up, the Apollo type of Greek art was taken over and became the Christ in Christian art. And this meant a very beautiful, young, very young figure and face, and beardless, serene of countenance, no evidence of struggle, no thought of crucifixion or even resurrection.
One of the interesting things to me has been that there is no portrait-like figure of Christ in Christian art until something like 430, well into the 5th century, that there are sort of stylized pictures of a philosopher teaching disciples, the Good Shepherd, but never never portraits or something that looks like it might be a real person, so that when in close to the time of Christ's life or Jesus's life, apparently that was not an important thing for people. It's only started later when there was no chance really of getting back to anything like an original portrait, that people began to imagine what the portrait of Christ Jesus should look like, and that it's so all those portraits are built on human imagination and reflect human longings, the longings of the people who designed them and the longings of the people who used them in pious practice and worship.
There is a gradual movement away from the classical Greek norm in certain of Jesus' characteristics. These changes represent the first modifications in the Christian style, as well as a new religious consciousness.
In the Mediterranean area, there developed another image, which was the mature, middle-aged man with a long beard and deep-set eyes, and who gave his attention to us out of the work of art, whereas the Apollonic Christ, or Good Shepherd Christ, was self-involved and didn't contemplate the spectator at all. And this image is the one that really did come to predominate.
During this time, the Church is the main patron of religious art, laying down rules for painters as to how they were expected to depict scenes from Jesus' life.
The churches were the most, were overwhelmingly the patrons of religious art, And bishops would, tell painters what they wanted, what scene they wanted, but then the depiction of that scene was left largely up to the painter. The contracts specify things like how much blue, how much azure, how much gold is to be used in the painting, because these were the precious items. And sometimes then later in the Middle Ages, how much the master painter himself had to paint and how much could be sort of filled in by his workshop. So we don't know how much was negotiated just as the work went on between the ecclesiastical authorities who commissioned the work and the painters. But of course the painters were working within a strong tradition.
Christ emerges in a form of austere spirituality, becoming the icon incarnate, embodying divine authority as depicted by the Pantocrator. For centuries to come, this remains as the predominant image portraying the physical likeness of Jesus. The same characteristics being repeated: broad forehead, arched eyebrows, straight nose, deep eyes, a kind, serious mouth, long hair, and a forked beard.
Generally, it's not the physical features. For example, in the iconography of St. Peter or St. Paul, you can turn to something in Byzantium or in Christianity and sort of say, that's Paul. It has Paul's attributes. But with Jesus, what you have is there, to my knowledge, there hasn't been a continuity between the facial features and it's the attributes which inform us that this is Jesus. I mean, the halo, the seated in glory, the position in the composition.
During a period of cultural quiescence, Romanesque art created new forms of expression, especially in sculpture and in painting. Jesus is depicted in either the dominant and transcendent presence in a scene such as the Vesile Pentecost, or the Christ who, as judge, rules at the Last Judgment. It becomes evident that Christians begin to depict Jesus as less of a Semitic man, which Professor Miles explains as the conscious marginalization of the Jew.
From the early 5th century on, I've written an article about the progressive marginalization of the Jew as a form of developing a self-consciously Christian society. That increasingly, if one looks at laws, if one looks at popular destruction of synagogues, if one looks at the way in which Jewish tradition and narrative in the Hebrew Bible is taken up into the Christian story and positioned as shadowy forerunner to Christianity, at the same time that actual Jews are being ostracized within society, you see a terribly ambivalent treatment of Judaism. At the same time that Christians want to associate with the scriptures, the ancient and honorable tradition of Judaism, it's an embarrassment to have actual Jews around who are still practicing Judaism. It's supposed to be a defunct religion, according to Christians, and yet there they are.
You can read that in many different ways. You can say that there's an intrinsic anti-Semitism running through Western culture, not a hard argument to make. Or you can say that every culture responding to its religious cult figure will inevitably, in some way, assimilate him or her to their experience. And now, is this racism, or is it an attempt to bring this religious reality into their lives, into the presence of their daily lives?
During the Gothic era, the focus of religious life shifted to the cathedrals and city churches, which lent majesty, serenity, and lyricism to Gothic art. The great cathedrals, their sculptures and stained glass, housed the new image of Jesus. However, as the medieval age darkened, stricken by plague and by cruelties, so the image of Christ began to change. the Lamb of God transforms into the man of sorrow. The Gero crucifix attests to a man of pitiful human form, distraught with pain. Although there is an increasing degree of assimilation taking place, there is, up until this point, no radical departure in the appearance of the face of Christ. Jesus is shown in the medieval images as depicted as either a beardless figure or the bearded mature likeness made familiar through Byzantine art, a type which had become the accepted portrait in resembling the physical appearance of Jesus. Artistically, the development which began in the early 14th century culminated historically in the rediscovery of the classical heritage. The early Renaissance in Italy saw art no longer humanizing faith, but reflecting humanity itself.
The dramatic thing that happened by the year 1500 and was happening all during the what is called the Quattrocento, the 1400s, was that the artist learned to be able to depict persons, places, and things in perfectly coherent ways as far as as if he had a camera and was able to take a picture of it. And that's the first time in the history of the world that that had happened in any tradition.
By the middle of the 15th century, portraits had become a new assertion of individuality, closely resembling their models. This would partly explain why a portrait of Jesus looked more European, since the artists were depicting the model's features as those of Jesus. The paintings of Giotto give an indication of the spark of Greek humanism, which show the Renaissance artist that the body is the vehicle of the spirit.
He's kind of a bridge figure who has a lot of the medieval world in him, but he's looking at how real human beings look. And so the gestures of Christ in his murals are those of human beings. They're not liturgical gestures that have been given again and again over the years.
The serenity which characterizes the art of Fra Angelico is present in much of the art of the first decades of the Renaissance. However, the effect which reborn classic art had upon the Renaissance artists and their culture caused tensions and a somber mood that is to be seen in much of the art depicting images of Jesus. The tensions inherent in the developing Renaissance style were briefly resolved in the period that is known as the High Renaissance, when artists began to react to humanist thought in a manner of expression entirely counter to the arts of the Middle Ages.
At that time, commissions begin to be made by town governments, by a whole wealthy class for in private homes, private devotional books, and so on, so that it's in the Renaissance that the market for religious images changes rather dramatically.
Although the High Renaissance is characterized by a great choice of biblical subjects, it is at this point in history that the image of Christ undergoes a dramatic transformation. The artist has more freedom in the manner in which he paints Jesus, and we see for the first time Jesus being portrayed in the ideal form of earthly beauty. Jesus is also painted in a more localized European manner than ever. It is noticeable that Leonardo paints Jesus in his own likeness, which depicts a more definitive Eurocentric image.
Michelangelo chose as his subjects, of course, for Mary, his sister, for Joseph, and for some of the poses for God, his brother-in-law, and for Christ, his nephew. And as the child, this image becomes the main image for centuries in Europe and later transported to Africa, Asia, Central, South America.
Separate from, and in some ways opposed to, the art of the Italian Renaissance is the art form of Northern Europe. whereas the art of Italy tends to ennoble man by emphasizing his finest potentialities. The art of the North underlines the finiteness, frailty, and fallibility of humankind.
Generally speaking, the northern image of Christ is one that does relate to the deep-eyed, soulful, bearded Christ, and much emphasis on suffering, so that subjects like the crucifixion and the flagellation of Christ are depicted with a horrifying realism, in fact, a surrealism.
During the ensuing Reformation and subsequent birth of Protestantism, very few paintings are painted of Christ in terms of high art, representing a trend that will change patronage, subject matter, and emphasis in the art of the subsequent centuries.
One thing we have to remember about the Reformation is that it was in fact a protest against the authoritative quality of medieval Christendom. So the Jesus image that arises following the Reformation is a shift away from a dominant king ruling over people, and a shift towards a Jesus that is accessible, more human, sensitive, vulnerable.
However, as Dr. Morgan states, this does not seem to be the case in terms of popular art.
At the level of popular devotion, images exploded. They were used extensively in these kinds of broadsheets that were used in the home, in Bibles. Luther's first translation of the New Testament, for instance, was profusely illustrated with woodcuts. So there was a real recognition of the pedagogical, didactic value of images.
Baroque art is no single style, and it therefore emerges as an international variety of expressions at the hands of artists of many different personalities and persuasions. As a result, the image of Jesus is characterized by a strong regional sense of individuality, often expressed in a dynamic theatrical manner.
And here, the Rembrandt emerges, and Rembrandt is surely the religious artist of all time, thus far, because he studied the Bible, and statistically, the number of drawings, etchings, and major works of art that he did on the life of Christ and Old Testament events is so large in contrast to any other category of his work. And these things were not commissioned, so it was Rembrandt himself who chose to do that. And he lived in the Jewish section of Amsterdam at one time and walked the streets looking for the Jewish type for the Christ. And we have a series of studies of the young men that he did drawings of and paintings, and then they appeared later in somewhat transformed shape in the Supper at Emmaus and all of his other religious works on Christ.
With regard to much of the religious art of the West, since the Renaissance, we note that certain trends have emerged. Christ is steadily portrayed as a person with non-Semitic features. Secondly, Christ's features are being represented as exemplifying the highest ideal of human beauty, and Christ is almost always being represented as a white European male. As social and political problems begin to weaken Europe, there is a spirit of revolution. The Church's monopoly on the image and iconography of Christ is shattered, resulting in a great variance in the image of Christ. Art becomes more refined and sensuous, with the exquisite art of the Rococo reflecting the lavish extravagance of the era. Romanticism and neoclassicism reflect a movement away from rationalism, towards the subjective side of the human experience of fantasy.
It's not until we get to the end of the 18th and 19th century that we get our model of the artist as loving to do something that no one's ever seen before and wanting to break all the expectations and so on.
There is a progressive decline in 19th century art, as seen in works depicting an emotional sentimentality. Contained within a domain of imaginative realism, Jesus is portrayed in a sense of idealistic authenticity.
I think one of the major developments in the 19th century comes really from 18th century critical studies of the Bible. And there was a move throughout much of the 19th century to reestablish for popular faith, for the church on a very broad scale, just who the historical Jesus was.
In the latter half of the century, a revolutionary fervor enveloped Europe, spawning a common ideology centered on a growing belief in democracy, individual freedom, and emerging social awareness. Artists gathered in groups based on their common interest, which saw the emergence of artistic movements such as the Pre-Raphaelites, Impressionists, and Post-Impressionists.
It's a sentimentality that is within the aesthetic of the 19th century, which is interesting if you look at the context. I mean, this is the Industrial Revolution. This is, you know, just if you look at Impressionism, which sort of seems like pretty pictures, this also arises at a time of high industrialization where nature and softness and so forth aren't really part of your everyday experience.
The socio-historic situation therefore contributed largely to the acceptance of a sentimental, weak, and unreal Jesus, as depicted by Ari Scheffer, Plockhorst, Dobson, and Hoffman. These popular painters robbed Christ of his strength, creating a sweet, poetic 19th century aesthete.
So when the sentimental Jesus comes in, who's sort of sweet and loving and gushy, at some level, that culture, that's what, at some gut level, they wanted the God-man Christ to be.
These images, stylized to the point of artificiality, lay the foundation for the image of Jesus that was to traverse the globe as bearing a likeness to Jesus. It is especially from the 19th century onwards that Christian missionaries reach out to spread Christianity to the New World, in allegiance with the colonializing European powers.
The 19th century missionaries, which was the great century, not the only one, but one of the great centuries of missionary activity, was also, and not accidentally, the period of Western imperial expansion. Now, the relationship between the missionaries and the imperial explorers and conquerors is a little more complex than we've been led to believe. There were times when the missionaries supported or prepared the way for imperial expansion. There were other times when they opposed it.
In this regard, what image of Christ would the missionaries have taken with them to the New World?
Images, for instance, play an important role in teaching the faith. They're used as pedagogical devices. This is what Jesus did. And the images that are used are European, Euro-American images of Jesus and the disciples.
It's probably not surprising that Jesus came to be viewed as a European, so to speak. I mean, because Europe was the center of civilization, culture, superior to the rest of the world. And if Christianity was superior to the rest of the world, to other religions, then Jesus, even though he may have been a Palestinian, of Jewish background and so on, he would tend to be viewed as a European, basically.
Many scholars agree that there are three different stages in human growth. I would say that in the primitive stage, people simply copy and imitate images of Jesus which are already created and established elsewhere. That's what happened to many non-European people when European missionaries, Christian missionaries, came to Asia and Africa and other parts of the world. And out of respect towards, maybe out of respect towards Christian missionaries, non-European people simply followed and copied the already existent image of Jesus, which is the Eurocentric image of Jesus.
And if the missionaries are wanting to present Christianity, they're going to give them what they know. I think that that is an unintended byproduct of the missionary movement. And at some level it did become, you know, a Western God, you know, being shoved down people's throats. It did. And so I don't say that it didn't, but I think that that wasn't intentional.
Which factors contributed to the acceptance of this European image in the minds of the non-European cultures?
What begins to occur when you have a literature, a theology that says, God, you are made in the image of God, and then you're presented with a phenotypical portrayal of one racial group as being that image, you're actually moving into the area of cultural colonialism. Obviously, and any psychiatrist, I'm sure, will tell you, it aided in keeping the African population subordinate to the white population, because the whites who were oppressing them and saying that they were masters and calling blacks inferior were white, and the images of God that was being circulated among them was also white. They had to have made some correlation that, well, if this man is white and God is white, then this man must be pretty right. Once we realize that there's a relationship between these two things, we can see the damage that this caused the psyche of the African population, or any non-white population, especially when the literature in the Bible tells you that God is, that you, the human, is made in God's image. That means then if the image of God is white, then only white people are truly in God's image, and we are somehow subordinate to that, or subs of that.
The transformation of the Christ image worked like a double-edged sword for imperialism. On the one hand, the natural tendency to envision God in one's own image, coupled with the prevalent feeling of racial supremacy, accelerated the transition process into a European Jesus. On the other hand, the distorted Christ image provided the Western powers with a powerful reassurance that they were the chosen race, destined to rule and guide the rest of the world.
Popular artists go to these colonies. Sometimes they don't go at all. Sometimes they just use photographs and images that make their way back, and cast the modern missionary in the role of Christ, and show him there healing children. I could show you, for instance, that Harold Copping was a British artist who worked for an English missionary society and illustrated a lot of their literature, and has the great white doctor with the pith helmet, looks like Albert Schweitzer, but he's also a religious man, and someone who carries with his physical medicine this spiritual medicine.
One question is whether religious conversion is an end in itself, or is part of the strategy of imperialism, or whether it is promoted in combination with military power. There are different questions. And I'm trying to say that we have to be rather subtle. We should not engage in blanket condemnation of missionaries just because they came from Europe. You know, I think that would be the worst kind of reverse racism that I don't think we should indulge in.
Accordingly, by the time the world moved into the 20th century, when the impact of Christianity was being felt in many corners of the world, Christ had already been completely transformed into a European personage. The 20th century is almost history, but the interpretation of the events of the decades leading up to it has been a venturesome undertaking. while the kaleidoscopic multiplicity of events at the present time are still dauntingly unclear. The first decades of our century were years of tremendous creative activity and ferment. When the world wars cut across Europe, many of Europe's finest writers and artists were lost. Searching for meaning to the madness that had produced such devastation, artists stripped art of its traditional subjects, questioning the values of the Western civilization and its culture. The styles of Cubism, Surrealism, and various other forms of non-objective art were by their very definition of their style inimical to religious subject matter, or alternatively depicted Jesus in abrupt abstraction. It was after World War II that America became the dominant power politically, economically, and culturally, becoming the new artistic center of the West. Abstract expressionism, pop art, and minimalism redefined art. Although the transformation in the image of Jesus has been a developmental process beginning from the early representations of Christ through to the Renaissance, it was not until the 19th and 20th century that the popular image of Jesus as we know it today had been effectively spread to all four corners of the globe. To this extent, no singular image has captured the imagination of devotional people as has Salmon's Head of Christ, which has been reproduced more than 500 million times and has been distributed around the world since 1941. One is necessitated to ask why Salmon's Head in particular has had such a tremendous influence in shaping popular devotion in America and around the world.
Salmon's imagery has, I think, received global circulation because a number of groups, church groups, mission groups in the United States have considered it their mission to send through the mail enormous amounts of pocket-sized images, wallet-sized images of the head. And it was distributed almost immediately by the Salvation Army and the YMCA during World War II. And private groups undertook that task after the war. Salmon produced an image that strikes hundreds of thousands of people as photographic. It's a studio-style portrait of Jesus. It's not an artist's rendition, it's a portrait. And people write me and say, in my research project, and say, this is a true, one woman said, this is a true photograph of Jesus. This is what he really looked like, and this is what I'm going to see when I go to heaven.
Salmon's images were also distributed at a time when the socio-historic context was right for such a reception.
There was a time in American life when sporting the image of Salmon was an indication of your patriotism and your commitment to an identification between identification of Christian morality and the American Constitution and the American government.
But more importantly, his devotional Christ is one of intimate friendship, displaying the ethos of a man who walks with me, talks to me, and tells me I'm his own.
These are images that are hung almost entirely in the home. They appear in churches, but it's a domestic piety. People tell me that Salmon's image directs their private devotions. He's hung in the bedroom, in the living room, at the kitchen table.
It is inevitable that this Christ, with his serene and kindly European face, would necessarily have inherent cultural and ethnic implications if one considers that this image has become archetypal for many religious groups.
African Americans writing uniformly despise the image. They see it as as essentially a racist image, part of a racist ideology. And they resent it because often, particularly for people writing me who are in their 50s and 60s, say, this is the image I was given in Sunday school, I grew up with in church, in Baptist churches, Black Baptist churches, for instance. And I grew up thinking, either being told explicitly or just assuming on the basis of the images, that Jesus was a white guy. And they resent it now as 50 or 60-year-old black Christians because it's taken them a long time to reprogram their visual imaginations.
However, it is true that certain kinds of sentimental Western depictions, like Solomon said of Christ, that's the classic, still have a certain popularity with people. I'm a little puzzled at times about why that is, except that I think we all become attached at certain points to the visual depictions that we learned or encountered as children. And that has a kind of a continuing effect on us. So I'm not surprised that some of these images that were imported or taken there still have a certain appeal. I don't think that's going to last over very much longer because of the demographic changes and enculturation.
As a reflection of present-day modern art, the image of Jesus is often perceived as abstract, obscure, and unrelatable. Responding to an innate human need, we reach into our imaginations to find an intimate, identifiable image. However, the image that the socio-norm endorses is the non-challenging male figure with fine European features.
And as a consequence, I think that the more rugged, burly male image is not the option people take when they're portraying Christ, who at some points becomes even more androgynous than you would find most males to be, for the fact that the androgyne in art and in literature has a special power of incorporating the best of both sexes, and so therefore is apart from both sexes. And I think that that explains why so many images of Christ seem to be effete, why they seem to be terribly fair, weak.
It is inevitable that the popular image of Jesus in America is shaped as a result of the influence from the popular culture as we see it in the movies, on television, in books and magazines, and at Christmas. It all seems to indicate that the popular image of Jesus, as dictated by the popular culture, is in turn determined by commercialism.
What is called popular culture, popular images, which are, as I say, commercial in their basis and want the largest possible dissemination so that the images are watered down and are sentimentalized for mass appeal.
All these magazines now are filled with beautiful gods and goddesses as determined by Madison Avenue. And that sets the canon of beauty for the Western world and beyond the Western world. And I think the same parallel can be held for religious imagery, where the images were produced and diffused around the world. That image pretty much encapsulated what the divine looked like.
Has the 20th century become the age of exploitation to the extent that the visual arts is a reflection of the civilization that produced them? What has happened to the church as a patron of the arts that it no longer commissions art? In the vacuum of not providing us with images, secular images act religiously.
The church used to be the great patron of the arts in Western history, and Renaissance history especially. And now I think there is in many places, although not all, there is a serious chasm between the church and the creative artists, whether they're painters or poets or filmmakers or whatever.
So I think it is a real neglect of churches in the end of the 20th century in America to imagine and commission images that would provide alternatives to the images of secularity.
The shade of difference is that terribly important thing which we call excellence. And I, as an art historian, am always seeking this. I believe that excellence is, artistically, aesthetically speaking, equal is perhaps not the right term. Let us say that you cannot have theological depth without aesthetic excellence, in my opinion. And that's an opinion that's been tested by many years of studying in this area.
Well, it's a milksop theology. I mean, it's just completely, this is, Jesus is your buddy, and he's gonna fix, you know, he doesn't even look powerful. He doesn't have a halo, you know, he's blonde and has shiny hair. I mean, it looks like a Breck commercial, really. I mean, you look at the Breck ads, it's very similar, which there's an advertising side to it, of sort of selling a product. I mean, I don't think that the issue there is to sell more copies of itself, because they're really cheap anyway. So, but there's a selling of what's, you know, that theology, which is, you don't really have to do much to be a Christian.
When the world entered the era of television and movies, the so-called Hollywood imagery played a significant role in shaping and maintaining the popular notion of the European image of Jesus.
I think the Hollywood record in depicting Jesus is dreadful, in a word. I mean, it has been Eurocentric, even worse than Eurocentric. It's been racist at many points. You have a blonde, blue-eyed Jesus, and when he gets when he's a little different from that, they never depart to anything very different than the Eurocentric Jesus. And Hollywood is driven by profit. They've got to produce a movie that's going to make money. It's going to bring people in. They've got to shape the story and the depiction in such a way that not too many people are offended.
Unfortunately, in casting, which is always attached to dollars, to appeal, to market, you find that the archaeological urge stops short and the box office concerns take over. And I think that's why in 20th century film, up until the present day, most of the paintings, or most of the films of, say for instance, The Passion of the Life of Christ, are based very much on paintings that people have looked at and have grown accustomed to. I think that's why the archetype of the Northern European Christ persists in film, because people looked at the antecedents in painting.
Some of the most significant subliminal images and overt images of Christ and of God itself being a white person have come out of Hollywood. We've got the 10th Commandment, we've got Spartacus, we've got the story of Noah, we've got the story of the Immaculate Conception, we've got the robe, we've got many others portraying Christ as white in a community that was far from being dominated by white persons at the time in history these things took place. But Hollywood have made this statement that most Americans have accepted, because they've portrayed these images using the finest stars, the greatest amount of money. These are some of the best films made, the ones dealing with Christ and with things, images out of the Bible.
For instance, Cecil B. DeMille's film, King of Kings, was seen by millions and millions of people. It was a silent film. People could comment on the film as the image was being shown to people from Tibet to Africa, South America, you name it. This image was impressed upon the psyche of humans around the world as being representative of Christ.
It is necessary at this point to ask why this European image of Jesus still continues to be the popular devotional image in non-European countries.
Non-Europeans seem to still be drawn to the image of Christ as being the image, because when they receive the information, when they receive the church initially, when they receive the gospel initially, It came with these images as being the portraits of the Christ character.
Under immense cultural influences from the West, especially through media images, non-Europeans still seek to adapt and emulate Western civilization and its very ambiguous achievements. It is therefore no surprise that the European concept of ideal beauty continues to sustain a Eurocentric image of Jesus.
Advertising now is the new thermometer for finding what images are being perpetrated and what images people look at and therefore find themselves wanting to be like that image or grabbing something out of that image. And I think that, look at the Calvin Klein ads. They're giving you a body type, both male and female, that people are to aspire to. The same sort of thing was happening in the Jesus representation in the years of Western missionary activity. And as a consequence, I think that wherever the image is perpetrated, whether it's in advertising or religious pictures and catechisms or posters or films, that image is going to subconsciously play an important part in how we understand femininity, masculinity, or divinity. That in fact, these images are laying the ground rules.
To say that Jesus was a European, he's presented this way, and this is the image of somebody you admire, you worship, then by implication you might be admiring and worshipping the rest of what's offered by Europe.
It's painful, isn't it, to see people depicting beauty as unlike themselves. But I think, you know, they have seen in the media so many depictions of beauty as white, as thin, as wealthy, and so on. I think media images are extraordinarily powerful, and even people who do not have particular kinds of experiences that would make those images resonant for them simply can adopt them. I have an example. My granddaughter is biracial, and she has always lived, she's 8 now, almost 9, and she's always lived in an area of San Francisco where the whole community is biracial. And yet, she has somehow picked up and internalized some racism. She keeps insisting that her skin is light, her hair is blonde like her mother's, and so on. And even though she has not, to our knowledge, received that in any face-to-face encounters, she has seen television a good deal, and all the pretty little girls there are blonde. And so even though it's actively combated in her home, this racism does have its effect on her through media images.
At a time when there is a growing awareness of cultural diversity, people will inevitably begin to imagine God in a way that will allow Him to minister to them and to have an intimate role in their life. This relates to the simple desire of humankind to envision the most holy figure in their own image.
Now, however, since the latter part of the 19th century and the 20th century, we have an absolutely profound change in the composition of Christianity. In my mind, the most important change since the one that occurred in the 1st and 2nd centuries. That is the change is that the majority of people who are Christians in the world today are not Europeans or of European extraction at all. They're Africans, they're Asians, they're Latin Americans, which is a mixture of European and, let's say, indigenous culture. And this is a profound change, both in the theology, in the worship, in everything having to do with Christianity, and also in the depictions of Jesus, which is to be understood. So we now have multiple depictions, visualizations from all different kinds of cultures. And I think that's a very healthy development.
I think it's good that we see images of Jesus coming now from many different cultural centers. It gives rise to or creates the possibility of a universalism, a Jesus that is equally accessible to all people with equal intimacy. It also tends to diminish the influence of an image that is tied to a single class or culture or race, and rather brings a Jesus more like his self-expression as we find in Scripture.
Through exploring the nature and power of images, we've discovered a wealth of images that have been created throughout the centuries. It is therefore essential for the survival of religious imagery that the contemporary church, whatever its faith or denomination, should have a living art. However, today the conventional image of Jesus still dominates in the minds of the public, perhaps because we are unwilling to risk the disruption of our beliefs and expectations, and seldom question the concepts and images presented to us by society. Is it not, therefore, in looking at the face of Christ that we are looking at our own spiritual and cultural identity, both as we exist presently and as we imagine we should be?